Parenting is amazing. It can be so beautiful and so hard. We all really want to raise healthy, balanced, faithful children, but,
we're trying to pass on this beautiful faith, and we're working out our own salvation right here every day with our kids.
My name is Christian Gonzalez. I'm the father of 3 wild, beautiful daughters.
And I'm Elissa Bjeletich Davis, and I have a whole house full of kids from tweens to young adults, and some already out in the world.
And we're here to join you on this journey through the highs and lows of parenting, amidst snotty noses, messy rooms, and busy schedules.
We don't have it all figured out, but we're in it with you. And our message is simple. Dear parents, you're not alone.
Welcome to Trials and Triumphs from the Trenches. Well, good afternoon, Elissa.
Good afternoon, Christian. How you doing?
Doing well. Happy to be back here with you, going further into our, series here on talking about the domestic monastery and just finding, times to return.
Yes, absolutely.
Because man, we need them.
We do.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm excited about this episode, actually, because I think it's a pretty cool topic. So
Yeah.
I'm fired up. Sixth
Yeah.
hour.
Well, yes, the sixth hour. So if you're just joining us now, in the last couple of episodes, we spent some time talking about the stories that we tend to wrap our lives around and how this feeds into the different stories that impact the way we, parent our kids, and the stories that we kind of put them in as well, and that they see themselves as a part of. And if you're interested, you can go back and check out episodes 6 and 7, which we call the third hour and heading out. So at least I'm just curious, kind of as we've been talking about these stories that we find ourselves to be a part of, how has it been trying to pay attention to the stories that you find yourself kind of continually getting conscripted into?
You know how, when you have just been talking about something and telling somebody else not to do something, how then you just find yourself doing it all the time? That is my current experience. It's
Yes.
we're sitting there talking about, you really want to be in this Christian story of repentance and growth, and you don't want to be in this money story. And then I started having all this situation with my job, and there's all this what's going to happen with my job? The company's going through changes. And suddenly my story was all about money, exactly as I was saying it shouldn't be. And so I'm getting there. I'm working on it. But I've really found myself lately working hard to refocus on the correct story, on prioritizing sort of my life as a Christian first, and then as an employee or a contractor or whatever second. And it's getting easier, but it was really hard, and especially right after the episode. So pretty much I would say you jinxed me. How about you?
that's the impact I have on people, from what I understand. Honestly, I get so busy that I tend to not really pay attention even to the stories that I'm believing, which means that the story that I'm probably living in is wrapped around believing that I am what I do. That it's really about how well I perform or whatever, whether my life is going to go well or not. Like even yesterday, I was gripped by anxiety thinking about retirement and whether or not that's a word that I will ever be able to embrace as a reality of my life. And just the fear that came along with it was so real. But it's just, I don't know, why not don't be dumb, plan to whatever extent you probably can, but realizing just how much my heart was wrapped into it was really kind of overwhelming for a minute. So
that's exactly how I've been feeling about. I'm shocked at how anxious I have been over my job situation. And it's the same kind of thing where it's look, you're doing all the right things, right? You're putting as much money as you can away. You're doing everything in a responsible way. Now stop thinking about it. And that's really hard to do.
It really is. And there's so much to pay for. And then student loans starting back up again. I don't know if you have any of those in your life still.
I'm very old, Christian. I'm old enough, but I do not.
I say I know, I know you're old. Yeah, I know you're old.
My kids' loans at this point. You do know I'm old. You know I'm old. I just turned 49 last week. I'm very old. Funny, I have no anxiety about that, but I'm anxious about all sorts of other things.
Yes,
but yeah, student loans are a great example of one of the things that they just sort of grip you, and We didn't talk about that before, but that really actually is an interesting thing about like what story are you in. A lot of times really anxiety will pull you into another story, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes it much harder to pull out. Like it's one thing to pull out of a story that's just a bad story, but it's another to try to manage the anxiety and keep yourself out of that story. It's hard.
Yes. No fun at all.
Yeah.
So, as we said, the thing that we're working on here and kind of exploring, I guess, is to remember, what story we're actually a part of. And it matters because when it comes to parenting our kids, it matters what kind of people we are ourselves. It's not just about like having good parenting techniques, but it's really about becoming the kind of people who can just have, authentically parent from a place of being grounded in Christ, which is so hard because that's the only way we can really lead ourselves toward or lead our kids toward Christ and to pass on
Yeah.
anything of the Orthodox faith to them as if it's something that we are embodying, and it's just a struggle.
That's
So
right. That's
yeah,
right.
but
So
today we're going to shift
yeah.
our focus a little bit to the 6th hour instead of being kind of
Yes.
promptly on the 3rd hour. And the 6th hour,
Yeah.
for those of you who are again following our domestic monastery kind of thing, is considered like noon. Like noon is what the 6th hour is, and so
Right.
we want to focus a little bit on what the fathers of the church call acedia, or more ominously, the noonday demon. That this is really kind of the thing that
Yes.
can take our attention midday
Yeah.
uh, and strike a lot of that fear, anxiety, and despair into our souls. So, um,
Really? Really?
yeah.
And I love that phrase, the noonday demon. Does that come from, is it from the Psalms, I think? Because I know that the
Yes.
fathers,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like an old thing, like old monks, right? Like back in the day, a lot of monks, I know Evagrius talked about it a lot. Like a lot of monks would talk about it because it was this problem for them during the day that at
Mm-hmm.
noon, they had the noonday demon would sneak in.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
what do
So
you, like, how do you define that? What is the noonday demon?
yeah. So it comes from a Greek word, right? That refers to a spiritual state that they call acedia, and the way we would probably translate this now is it shows up in a lot of those lists of deadly sins that uh, some of the early monks put together, like you said, Evagrius did, and I think even like Gregory the Great kind of put together his own list of uh, deadly
Mm,
sins and things like this. But this is what we often look at as that deadly sin of sloth. I think that
yeah,
sometimes this like sloth when it shows up in those lists, it feels a little bit out of place.
yeah,
And it's not really just like a sloth in terms of like like a laziness or wanting to like lounge around on a
mm,
Saturday or just generally feeling like you need to relax. And it's not
yeah,
even really the same thing as neglecting to fix that sink that you've been meaning to fix for a long time.
right.
But it's
But that's what it
something,
sounds like. I mean, that's what we
yes.
think of it as, right? And then you think of like a Puritan work ethic or something like, well, I'm never supposed to just sit down and relax. And that's crazy, right? Like we all need to relax a little bit. Why would
Yeah,
that be
that's
on
it.
the
And I,
list?
I think like
Yeah,
sloth, we hear so much through our Western mind of kind of those stories, right? Of like being a
yeah,
part of the economic system and being a contributing member of society and like whatever. But it turns out even our doing those things can still be like a symptom of our sloth. It can still be a symptom of our acedia, as the fathers would call it. So Evagrius really, talks about acedia quite a bit because he considered it to be one of, if not the most problematic spiritual states for monks and nuns in the desert. And the reason that it's called the noonday demon really makes a lot of sense. So uh, I live in Phoenix, so I feel like I'm entitled to give a description of what this feels like, right?
yes,
Because the desert
yeah,
mothers and fathers, they would be out in the desert themselves, spending their days in intense prayer and fasting, giving themselves to the physical and ascetical labors. And so by the time that desert sun reaches its peak in the sky, they've been at it for quite some time already. And so life really can start to get uncomfortable. And again, as someone who lives in the desert, the brutality of the midday sun, I cannot overstate just how exhausting it is. It can just zap you. of all life and all joy. It kills all
Oh,
kinds of plants. It's just, it is not a environment that anybody really feels like they're living their best life in. You
yeah.
know, it's
Yeah,
brutal.
absolutely.
So that's where this kind of notion of the noonday demon sets in, because that's really about the time of day that this, sense of sloth or an overall like torpor would kind of like settle
Yeah,
on monks and nuns, right?
yeah. And so that's where you're saying it's not like just, oh, I'm going to relax for a little while. Like it's noon, I'm going to put my feet up for a minute. It's really like much worse than that, right? It's more like dejection. You think
Mm,
of that word of like that you just have this overall feeling, kind of a despairing feeling that it's like nothing's worth doing, right? Which is
hmm.
very different from, oh, I need a little break, right? It's very, very different. Like, and nothing you do matters. You sort of are frustrated with the other people around you. You hate the task ahead of you. You hate, the other brothers and sisters in the monastery there who are there with you. And of course, it would lead to like a slackness in spiritual practices or an
Hmm.
overall boredom. So it is sloth in the way that we think of sloth, but there's this like real dejection and real negativity in it that I think sometimes sloth doesn't capture. I
Yes,
wouldn't, yeah.
exactly, because it's really like this, the way that, man, I can't remember who wrote the book. There's a great book called Despondency, that really explores
Are you
the
talking about
notion of,
Nicole Rokas? Dr. Nicole
no,
Rokas with Time and
uh-uh,
Despondency? No, different one?
no,
She
but
was
that
all
was
over
also a great
Evagrius.
book.
It was good. She was
um
all over Evagrius and what he was saying about it.
oh
But
man, the book is just called
hmm,
Despondency.
that's it.
And
Okay.
so yeah, and the guy who wrote it looks at it through the work of Evagrius as well, and he sort of talks about it as this like concurrent reality of anger and dissatisfaction. So there's kind of like this
Ooh.
dissatisfaction and a longing for everything else other than what you have, while being angry that the reality of what you have is what you have. So it's like
Oh,
the
wow.
idea that you can be bored and whatever and just be like, man, I really don't want to do this. Like, I wish that there was someone that I could hang out with, or like I should go visit one of my brother monks or whatever. And then you look out your window and you see one of the brother monks walk out and you're like, oh, but not that guy. Like, I don't want to go talk to that guy. So like that's kind of this
Yeah.
despondency or sloth of just not wanting to show up to anything that is like actually what your life is. Like
Yeah.
that's the slothfulness, is a lack of a desire to just show up, right? It's the sense that,
Yeah.
one's life has become nothing that they thought that it should be and has become everything they were worried it would become, right? Like
Oh,
it's that sense that and that nothing is going to make it better, and that really nothing could make it better.
I
um,
feel I
so
feel like you're describing my 13-year-old. Like, you
yeah.
know what I mean? That sort of sense of like that angsty sense of like everything's lousy and I got the worst deal. Everybody else is fine, but I got this bad deal and I just got dealt the wrong hand. And but I mean, there's that, but also even as a parent, for sure, right? Like there are certainly times when it's hard to show up. I like the word despondency for it. I really do.
Hmm.
Like just that sense that nothing's going to get better. There's not even anything that could intervene to make it better, right? Like you're not even really thinking realistically of ways to fix it or something. It's just like, nope, it's all terrible. It's all
Yeah,
terrible.
and
And
it's tough because
anything
it's
you
it's
want
different
is
than,
imaginary.
yeah,
Oops. Yeah.
exactly. And that's the great temptation of it, right? Is to like live
Yeah.
in your imagination about everything else other than what your life actually is. So I do think
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that this is different than what we talk about, like with a clinical kind of depression, right? Like like a
Yeah.
psychological depression where there can just be like, an overall hopelessness, or people aren't like getting enough sleep, or they're getting too much sleep, or they're gaining too much weight, or losing too much weight. Like
Yeah.
that's a real thing that is not simply this kind of like spiritual thing. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into clinical depression versus this
Yeah.
acedia that the desert fathers and mothers were so worried about, because what they were so worried about with acedia was that it would lead to like a kind of burnout or an overall frustration with the spiritual life, and ultimately just lead someone to like give up on it because nothing that they do really matters. They're like, what's the point? Like there's like it's different than a depression, right? Like what's the
Yeah.
point of even showing up to this thing? It feels different to me than someone who's in that kind
Yeah.
of like depressive emotional mood state.
Yeah.
But this spiritual state is definitely got its own list of logismi, right? Like those thoughts that come along uh, with
Yeah.
acedia,
Right.
of like, yeah, like why should I even bother? Like my kids probably don't even really like me. Why do I need to parent them anyway? Like they're just a
Right.
bunch of jerks anyway, and all they do is
Right.
yell at
Nobody's
each other.
listening.
Like,
Nobody's
yeah,
listening
so
to me.
like
I give.
exactly nothing
Yeah.
nothing matters. So
Yeah.
why show up? But I think what's really tough as I think about acedia is that if I'm honest, uh, despondency, sloth, acedia, like these are some of my favorite sins. Like if
Oh, that's so true. That is actually
um
true of you, Christian. I think that's really true. That's
yeah,
really funny. That's kind of
yeah,
funny.
and I doubt that I'm alone in it.
Oh, I'm sure you're not.
Maybe I
I'm sure you're
am,
not. No,
but
I'm
there
a little
is
more
like that
Pollyanna
overall
than you,
listlessness.
right? I'm a little more Pollyanna. I'm like, "Woohoo, what's up next?" But,
Yeah.
yeah, I have my own sins that I am embracing,
Yes.
so there's that. But, yeah,
And
I
it's
think
not
you're right.
even like a self-pitying, like everything is the worst kind of thing. It's much more of a like, why bother?
Yeah,
Why
yeah.
bother?
Well, and you can see why they call it the noonday demon, right? Because if
Mm-hmm.
you're a monastic out in the desert and you just kind of give up, and not really for any good reason, right? It's just this sort of like weird, sort of negative, bad, despairing, despondent thinking, and it just kind of continues and continues, and then you just walk away, right? Like that's your salvation on the line. And there's this beautiful gift God's giving you, and you're just sort of turning it down and walking
Mm-hmm.
away over something that's not real exactly, right? Like it's not, you're not showing up to your reality, which is in fact not as bad as you think it is. So
Yeah.
it's, yeah, it makes sense that they would associate it with a demon because in that sense, I mean, this is definitely something that leads to perdition, right? So
Yes.
it's a big
Giving
deal.
up.
Yeah,
It's the
it's
opposite of right
huge.
when Jesus says of like, he who endures to the end shall be saved. This is the
Yeah,
temptation to throw in the towel.
yeah.
Like,
And as parents, that's a big deal because we don't just take ourselves down. I
mm-hmm.
mean, it is kind of a big deal. So it does, I think, I think the acedia plays sort of the same role with us as it would with the monks in the desert, even though our lives in so many ways are very different, right? But we still have this like middle of the day. I mean, it could happen anytime, but
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of the day, you're like, maybe you've been working all morning and you stop and you have lunch and you just feel like tired and you just don't want to get back to it. You just don't want to go back. Like you just don't know if anything you're doing is really worth it or does it have any kind of impact or and as a parent at home, you can feel that like if the kids are
Mm-hmm.
really a mess and it's going poorly and you know, you all sit down for lunch and they run off and you've got this messy kitchen and you're just sitting there feeling like why am
And
I
nobody
bothering?
wants to help you clean up. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're just run. Yeah, exactly. Like,
Yeah. And no one
why?
sees what you're doing and no one knows about what you're doing and these kids aren't listening and they don't care and it
And if you're in
I can
Phoenix,
see
it's
it
too hot
happening.
to go outside or to have the kids run
Yeah.
around. Like, and so you're
Yeah, or
stuck with
Texas
them.
too. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like your brothers and sisters in the monastery, for lack of a better way of putting it, become a great source of your discontent. You're like, this is really tough.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Like this is, you know, no
Yeah.
bueno. And so it does become easy to just begin, like we said before, living in your imagination about everything else that could be,
Yeah.
and that again, there becomes that abiding sense of, my life is nothing that I thought it should be and everything I was worried it would become. And so
Yes.
now I need to escape somehow. Um,
Right?
but again, then it's exhausting, like you're exhausted and you can't even think about escaping. And, we begin to feel so isolated in all of it. And
Yeah.
as that kind of spiritual state of sloth or an unwillingness to show up to life settles in, you might even think like, oh, maybe I should reach out to somebody. And then like, there's been times actually where I've said this to my wife where I've been like, hey, like, I feel like I should go out to lunch with somebody or something. And she's like, well, what about so and so? And I'm like,
Not him.
yeah,
Ugh,
exactly.
gross.
Yeah, like I don't want to do that. Like it's just like for any reason, right? It's like they live so far
Mm,
away. Like they're whatever. They're busy. What like
yeah,
whatever, right?
yeah,
And it has nothing to do with them. It has nothing to do with that person. It has everything to do with the state that
yeah,
I'm in. It's that
yeah.
acedia, right? Nothing is good enough.
No,
Um,
that's
anything
totally
like that
true.
ever come your way?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think everybody goes through it, right? Like I think it's a normal sort of thing. I think especially when I was home with my kids, I had a lot of kids, right? And so there were times when I would be, the at-home mom, husband working late, just sort of, grinding through. And for the most part, it was great. But there were definitely times when the kids were just, they were off too. Like their mood would be off and my mood, and maybe it even started with me, but like there's that sort of mirror neuron problem happening of everybody's becoming miserable and everybody's fighting and unhappy. And you just feel like this is just not worth it. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
burnt out and lonely, and there's nothing that's going to help. And it's funny because sometimes people will come to you, like you're saying with your wife, right? Like my mom or one of my friends might be like, you really need to put your feet up and relax. Like maybe, you and your friends should go out to dinner, or maybe, a spa day or something. And you're just like, that all sounds terrible. I don't think that sounds fun at all. I don't think that would help.
Even
That's not
that
going to
sounds like a
fix it.
lot of work.
Right. Well, I mean, that's for sure. Right. Like that's a whole other story about like that problem of feeling like you're overwhelmed with work and then everything you're supposed to do to help yourself is just more work. But yeah, I think you
Yes.
get to that feeling and it's just like, it's a wild discontent that can plague
Mm-hmm.
our lives. It if you can't break out of it, like if you're sticking in it for a while, it's just awful. It's just awful. It's really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I
Yeah.
think like the tough part of it, right, for me at least, trying to square in my mind, like as a therapist, but just also just in human experience, right, is that there's some part of it I think that's at least somewhat understandable,
Oh
and
yeah.
possibly even worth listening to, and that's like the great temptation in it, right, is that it's
Yeah.
like it takes the one, like a bit of truth and then makes that the whole truth. Like
Yeah.
that's the great temptation, I think, with acedia, because our feelings, these thoughts about something being wrong or whatever, like something's not right with my life, isn't necessarily a bad thought. It's just kind of a
Right.
thought, you know and I think when we're frustrated or upset, when we're dissatisfied, when something's going on, like that can be some pretty interesting information to listen to, right? But
Right.
instead of being curious about what that information is trying to, like, or what that thought's trying to show us, we can
Yeah.
frequently give into the temptation of the noonday demon and let the anger and dissatisfaction fester, which is what leads us into fantasizing about that different life situation, whether it's a job, or a different job, or a different place to
Yeah.
live, or different
Yeah.
friends, or like a different family situation, or
Yeah.
different house. I mean, like pick a thing
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is dissatisfying.
Yeah.
um but
I feel like
I
you
do
see
get
this
that it's
in
reasonable.
I feel like you see this like damaging marriages as well, right? Like
Hmm.
if my husband were like this, if my wife were that kind of a person, and instead of sort of showing up with this wonderful person who you selected and figuring things out, you have this temptation to imagine, well, if I had done it all differently, or as you said, a house, right? That's a huge one. Or, if I were to buy this or buy that, right? You get stuck back into that story where there's some kind
Yeah.
of consumer path to happiness. And I think all of it is very dangerous. But the thing is that at the same time, obviously, like you said, like this can draw our attention to something in a healthy way, right? So if you
Hmm.
have this thought that, this really feels useless, I feel like this is not working, I mean, maybe you do need to be stopping and thinking, this job is not very satisfying. Maybe there's a different job I should have, or maybe, I don't have a lot of friends and maybe I'm isolated. Maybe I need to do something about that, whatever it is, right? Like maybe it's a call to go fix it. But then the temptation is instead of kind of rolling up our sleeves and getting to it, we're, heading out and imagining something else and then
throwing in the
being
towel.
destructive. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Giving up.
Giving,
Giving up.
giving up, and just
Yeah.
instead of fixing the thing, like you said, or getting to rolling up our sleeves, like,
Yeah.
um,
Or
yeah,
like parenting, if
imagining
you
what
think
life
it's
could be
not
like.
working, right? If you think it's not working,
Yeah.
maybe you're doing it wrong. Right? Like
Yeah.
there's a chance that maybe you should just think about a different approach, right? And then
Hmm.
everything will be fine. And it's like, oh, look, your guardian angel sent you this message. And now you've used it to just give up and sort of spin down into a spiral. And
Yes.
but you're right.
And at the
It's
same,
hard to tell. Sorry.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. It is, because I think that like that's the great temptation of the noonday demon, is to begin living in an imaginative world where we are not facing reality, where we're not living in the truth of like what's in front of us, and that's really where we get into trouble, right? Like where you
Yeah.
think like, why bother? Like this is like this reality that I live in is unmanageable, and everything is the
Yeah.
worst. But the hard thing is, like, of course, too, there are times when things actually are really difficult, and it's not just like, oh, you know what, I don't really like my job, or you know what, like, I'm whatever. But there can
Right.
be really terrible, horrible, no good, very bad things that come our way. But
Yeah.
so much of it is, our the way we relate to that reality. I think that's really tough. Like recently I was chatting with someone, whose child has a chronic illness, and they were saying that just so much goes into like managing it and these different crises that come up, that there isn't really time to reflect on life. And they're glad about that, because that when the dust does settle, they like all they run into is this sense of despondency. So
Oh,
like that's where the tough thing is, right? It's like, well, yeah, like your child does have a chronic illness, or a child who's diagnosed with something like ADHD or autism or what, like those are actually really hard realities to live in,
mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
but I think that
Yeah.
the hard thing is to like realize that that's where the noonday demon wants to like make the trauma even doubly worse, right? Like
Yeah.
there's
That's
already this
yeah.
actual trauma, and
Yeah.
that's where we're vulnerable to be like,
Mhm.
you could just walk away from the kid. You
Yeah.
could just
Yeah.
give up, just give
Right.
up.
Or yeah. Or even just that, like putting your energy into wishing, like, oh, I wish they weren't sick. I wish they didn't have this condition. I wish, and I've had kids with some pretty severe conditions. And for sure, in my experience, there's a huge difference. Just enduring it is
Mm.
so much easier if you're not giving into those kinds of thoughts, because you begin to resent it, you begin to be angry with it, and it's like you're fighting it, but that's your reality. So you can't fight your reality, right? Other than abandoning your child or doing something awful, right? Like, which in the end is just going to make everything worse for you and them. But,
Mm.
it is, I feel like there's a way that we have to go, sort of go with God's will, right? Like it's God's will that this is here. This is what it is. This is how it is. And it's my job to figure out what to do next. But it's hard.
Mm.
It's hard. And it's not something that's easily fixed, right? It's very hard.
Yeah, no, not at all. And it's funny because realized I had this realization the other day where, talking about kind of like the frustrations or the whatever that come along with like these realities, is that I've
Mm-hmm.
begun to realize that any frustrations or about reality in my life is based in this somewhere like the deep rooted belief I have that like I'm owed something by the universe, right? Like that I'm entitled to a particular way of life that feels and looks good, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm owed that
Yep.
somewhere.
Yep.
um but that's
Yeah.
just not that's not reality. We can't, imagine or
Yeah.
live in a world that does not exist, and
Yeah.
I can imagine anyway too that you know well, like mental health issues for young people are really at an all-time high, kind of
Yes.
on the backside of the pandemic. And I don't really, I'm not one of the people that thinks like the pandemic caused all these things, but I do think that our isolation and the fear and the division and all of this stuff,
Yeah.
poured lighter fluid on a fire that was already burning,
Yeah.
and so it
Absolutely.
exploded, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure that there's a lot of young people, a lot of parents with young people who are depressed and anxious, who do desperately wish they could escape their lives. And it's tough. It's tough to say like, hey, we need like, it's not as simple as getting a new situation in life.
Yeah.
It's not as simple
Um,
as getting a new therapist. It's
yeah.
this is something
Yeah.
that we need to show up for, and there's real moments in life uh, that we need to face with courage, and
Absolutely.
that is what acedia does not want us to do.
Yeah. Well, I think what's really hard is that we feel like we have to face everything alone, right? And
Mm,
that's what acedia is telling us too, right? Like that you're all alone, no one else cares. There's nothing that can be done. But really, and sometimes we do have to face things alone, and it can be very isolating, like the hermits out in the desert. But I think that's the problem, right? It's pulling us away from others. It's pulling us down into ourselves and into our own sense of wondering, you know, why are we even showing up? Why are we even bothering? And I think, that isolation, I feel that that's just always at the root of temptation. The temptation is always to be pulling away from others, not clinging to others, not reaching out to others and saying, wow, I'm really struggling with this, but to just keep struggling and isolating. And I don't know. I think that's always a big part of all temptations, and it's a big part of
yes.
acedia too.
Yep, I can do it on my own.
Yeah, yeah.
Pull
Or I have
yourself
to
up
do
by
it.
your spiritual bootstraps.
There's another story you might be living in, right? Like I have to
Yes.
do this without help. I have to do it
Yes,
without help.
exactly.
Yeah. But so okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So like what do we do, right? Like if this
Hmm.
acedia or sloth or despondency, whatever you want to call it, if that's the temptation that we're all facing, what do we do, Christian?
Yeah, well, I think since the whole idea of this being the noonday demon
Mm-hmm.
is there, which again isn't to say that it only strikes at noon, but as those who've walked the spiritual path before us have experienced, right? Like
Yeah.
it loves to show up around then. Like
Right.
it's a really nice time. Like while it's waking up, it's trying to put you to sleep. Um,
That's right.
so I do think like lunch break, there's a pretty nice little time there to slow down and return. Like anytime we get to stop and have lunch. But again, there's a big question even there of like, I know there's some days where I'm just like working back to back to back to back all the day long. I don't have any time to stop
Yeah.
and kind of return. But if lunch does come our way, if we do get a break, it does seem like that's a really easy time to get sucked into the like, oh, I don't want to go back to work, or like I don't want to like think about all the whatevers that are coming my way after work, or just all of that kind of stuff. Like that's a really good time where the whispers of acedia can get our attention. And so I think that we can see that also as an opportunity for a massive reorientation back into
Absolutely.
the Christian story. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really interesting, even as we look at the 6th hour prayers of the church, a
Yes.
lot of them, at least that I was coming across, really focus on the crucified Christ. Because I think that's interesting that noon would be a time when a lot of our latent sufferings can pop up, right? And
Right.
so at the 6th hour, what does the church put before our mind? The
The
suffering
cross.
servant,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there he is.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and I mean, and he was
yeah,
crucified at noon, right? That's when he was put on the cross. And so all of our prayers look back to
I think
that.
the third wasn't he crucified at the 3rd hour?
I think
9, right?
he's on the cross at noon and he's off the cross
He,
at 3. So maybe
yeah,
it's that it's the middle of it is
is the
noon.
middle of it.
That's the
Yep, middle
center
of
of
his
Christ on the
suffering.
cross.
Yep,
Yeah, that
yep,
makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, but it's so, I mean, it does sort of pair beautifully with this problem of suffering at noon and sort of bringing to our attention the fact that Christ also suffered. And I think
yeah.
too, like when you look through the prayers, and I'm not saying like, oh, you're going to have to start reading the hours now and then you'll feel better. But I do think, going through some prayer books and looking at the 6 hours, at the 6th hours prayers, however you say that, the prayers for the 6th hour, they're actually really beautiful because it's a lot of gratitude for Christ being on the cross. And I think it's interesting, it's a lot of, I don't know, I'm going to have to find an actual quote here because it's just neat. But it's like, O Christ our God, who at this hour did stretch out your loving arms upon the cross, that all might be gathered to you, help us and save us who sing to you, glory to thee, O God. And that, like, this pulling close to Christ and just seeing, like, there's this beauty that you have suffered for us. And, that's the solution to that isolation, right? Is to see Christ on the cross and understand that that was for us, and that we can come close to him in our own suffering, and that he sort of feels our suffering and we feel his. There's this communal suffering situation going on. And I think just inviting Christ into it is a tremendous difference. I think that
Yeah.
helps very much.
Well, and two, recognizing like he's already in it. He's already been in the middle of it for quite some time, and maybe now our eyes are just opening to the fact that like we're there too. That we also are at the hour of our crucifixion.
I like that.
And so I think, yeah, like, this is just the reality. This is the reality of the sixth hour.
Like, right. Well, and it's fun.
What a pain.
You were saying this feeling that like maybe you're owed something. I think I've said this before, but one of my priest's best advice ever was, he was like, don't ever ask why me, but ask why not me. Right. And it's this sense of like, Christ is on the cross. Suffering is this universal thing. There's no reason that I wouldn't be a part of this story of being on the cross, of suffering, of struggling. And it is kind of reassuring, right? Because it reorients you back to like, oh, okay, this is a part of life. This is a normal part of life. And there are other parts of life too. And I think it helps.
Yeah. And that's the invitation to endure, right? And by enduring too, I think it's important to kind of like understand enduring is not about ignoring, right? Like Christ did not ignore the cross. Like he was not like, what cross, right? Like, I don't know what you're talking. Everything's fine. Like he's on there. He's like, I'm thirsty. He's, a lot of this is done for the sake of fulfilling prophecies and all of this kind of stuff, but it's real. Like the cross is real. So I don't think enduring the cross is the same as ignoring our feelings and just saying, this doesn't really matter how I feel right now. Like I just need to suck it up and I need to keep going. The way we feel matters, but it's just not the only thing that matters. It's not the only thing that is real. So I think lunch can become a really good time for us to slow down, to certainly get curious about what's on our mind. Like again, I think about that person I was talking to saying that like they don't ever really stop and slow down because there's always crisis after crisis. And I kind of wish for them that they had more of an opportunity to do it in a helpful way, right? To like slow down and be like, what's going on in me? Like what am I feeling that I'm owed that I'm ignoring? Because that's where resentment builds, right? If I don't pay attention to some of that stuff. But I do think it's an opportunity for us to bring things before God in prayer, and to recognize that suffering is just like you said, a part of reality. It's a part of the equation for us when it comes to life in Christ. And I think that this can be a good time for us to reflect too, like on our relationships with our kids, with our our spouses if we're married, and all of this stuff, to say like, hey, like what's happening in me, and are things really going well? Like am I actually connected to them in the way that I want to be? And I think that those feelings can really give us some good information, and give us an opportunity to change the way we approach those different circumstances, because a lot of times circumstances can't be changed. Like chronic illness, whatever, like that circumstance is what it is. But the invitation from acedia is to not show up for that. The invitation from the crucified Christ is to show up for it, is to let that thing do its work on us. And that's hard. It's so hard. My God, it's so hard.
Well, and like you say, I mean, the invitation is to let you feel like that thing and your feeling about it is the only thing that matters and the only thing that exists, right? And when we can stop and think a little bit about our role in our family and the people around us, right? Like, how is this influencing these feelings that I'm having? How is it influencing my behavior at home, right? Because like I know if I'm not doing well emotionally, everybody can feel it. And at dinner, after school, when I pick people up, whatever, I'm not the same, right, as I should be if I were at my best. And I'm having some kind of an impact on the family. I'm having an impact on the children, on my spouse. And so it's like, what would it look like to try to change the way that I'm thinking about it so that I can engage with them? I don't know exactly how to say this, but like, how do I change the way that I'm thinking about this circumstance, which maybe itself cannot be changed, but how do I change the way that I'm thinking about my struggle with it, my pain with it, right? Like, am I allowing it to be the only thing that matters, or am I kind of putting it in its place and saying, like, you know what, this is really hard and this is difficult, and I'm going to work on that, but I'm also going to be grateful for these people that I'm connected to, and I'm going to spend some time investing in that, because that's a good thing that I have, and that I can, not to say that the other thing's going to stop existing, but to say, let's balance that out a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And those connections they matter so much, and they're the reality of our lives. It's funny that you're talking about like the way that I'm thinking or feeling. Of course it impacts things.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we even live in like this like spiritual reality of like, we kind of spiritualize that idea that like, oh, like this, all of it is this like ocean of spiritual, emotional, whatever. But even like on a biological level, like on a material level, this is
Oh, yeah.
true. So um our hearts, like our physical hearts, actually emit like a electromagnetic field, which is really wild.
It's crazy.
um that based on the, in some ways, the like the way that we're feeling impact the material world around us. So for example, there's been experiments done where people have like put on like little like electrodes or whatever, or they connect electrodes to like yogurt, that has like cultures of bacteria living in it or whatever. Have you heard of this?
No.
This is wild. And so then what they'll do, they'll put a person next to the yogurt, and they'll be reading like some sort of activity in the yogurt. This is all very, obviously I know exactly what I'm talking about here,
Yeah.
but they will give their interview subject like something really distressing to think about. They're like, tell me about something in your life that's kind of making you worried. And when they start thinking about it, the activity in the yogurt bacteria like spikes. So like they
Oh, that's so
see
crazy.
like the anxiety level go up in the yogurt somehow.
Like, the
So like there
bacteria
is,
have a
the bacteria
reaction.
is responding somehow to like the person's emotional state.
Elder Thaddeus was a genius, because he was totally saying this, right?
Dude,
Like, in our
yes.
thoughts determine, yeah, our thoughts determine our lives. He talks a lot about this, about how your emotional state is really like actually going out into the world, and it
Yep.
really is impacting people around you. And
Yes.
like you're saying,
Because
it's
we
not
are,
it's not just spiritual, it's biological, it's real.
yes, because we
It's
are
amazing.
both, right? Like our spiritual
So
things
cool.
are material. Like there is a material reality that is connected with the spiritual reality. Like this is the whole idea of the sacraments, right? That like those
Yeah.
things exist in the same space together. I don't
Yes.
know. It weirds me out, but it's
Yeah.
important
I
to
was just gonna say, I
realize
don't know
like
if this is wonderful or just awful and weird or what that is. Like,
it's
I don't know how to
all
deal
of
with
the
the,
above.
like, now the responsibility for the mood of the bacteria in the yogurt that I eat. Like, oh no. I'm gonna, like, I hope I haven't
All
ruined their day while I was eating them.
all of the above, man. It's like it's crazy, it's creepy. But in the same, there's been like experiment, there are certain like data that's been collected around like really catastrophic like world events, where there's these computers that like just generate random numbers all the time, right?
Okay.
This is,
Mhm.
dude, this is, it's crazy that this is what happens. They just generate random numbers, and then when there is a like world event that captures a lot of people's attention, and everyone kind of finds themselves in a similar emotional state, like 9/11 was one of the examples that they used in this study. I can't remember where I found this, but
This cannot
promise
be
that I read
right.
this or saw
This
this
is
somewhere.
crazy.
That when that happens, like those computers stop generating numbers in a way that can be considered random. Like the emotional impact of like people experiencing the same thing is like so great that these generating numbers, that these generating computers or whatever, stop acting randomly. Like there's a discernible pattern that begins to emerge
I
somehow.
want to
So I don't
apply
know.
this to like the lotto or something and just see, like, was it no longer randomized like on September 12th? I don't know.
Yeah, I
That
don't know.
seems impossible.
Anyway,
It seems
I know.
impossible, but I believe you. And I do
Yeah.
think, I mean, I think the truth is we are only beginning to understand things, right? Like
Yes.
we're only beginning to understand what kind of energy we're putting out into the universe. But for sure,
Yes.
in our family, like, you don't have to believe in the electrodes and the bacteria and all of that stuff to believe that if you're miserable, your kid knows it. And that's
Hmm.
just true. That's just true.
And
Your
if
kid knows
they're
it, your spouse
miserable,
knows it.
you know it.
Oh,
Like
for sure.
it's both ways, right? But
Yeah.
the thing is, we can't expect an 8-year-old to have as much emotional awareness as a 38-year-old, right?
Yeah.
So like that 38-year-old needs to act like a 38-year-old instead of wishing that the
Yeah.
8-year-old acted like a 38-year-old.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Yeah.
all this is to say, right, that acedia and despondency really is just about a total discontent with what is. And I, as I think about Christ being crucified, I can only imagine how I would have felt if I had been on the cross, like desperately wanting off the thing, complaining about what had come my way. But again, I think the big difference, well, one of the big differences between me and Jesus is that even in the midst of the cross, Jesus is unwavering in his trust in God. Like he just completely trusts that on the
Mhm.
other side of a shameful death, he will be vindicated by the Father who will raise him from the dead. Right? Like
Yeah.
this is the
Yeah.
trust. And so I wonder if perhaps kind of at its root, despondency, acedia is really coming from a sense of not trusting God, right? Of
Yes.
not finding him and his provisions actually to be trustworthy.
Totally. I think so. And I think when you look at it that way, that's where you can see how some of the spiritual practices that we have really matter and can really help us
Mm.
with this because they impact the way that we experience God and the way that we see God, whether we find God trustworthy, right? Like, for instance, I think that trust has a lot to do with gratitude, right? Like, if I can
Mm-hmm.
be grateful for the things God has done for me, then I'm aware that God is constantly doing things for me and I can trust that he'll continue to do those good things for me, that he's got me, that he's taking care of me. And so,
Yeah.
I feel like trying to keep a list, when we're really struggling with these things, start a list. What are you grateful for? You could do like a couple of things every day, or you could just have a running list where you're always trying to think of new things and you're
Mm-hmm.
like reading through the list of things that you've already listed. And what you're really doing is reminding yourself that God is trustworthy, that you can
Mm.
trust him. It's like the manna in the desert with the Israelites, right? Like he has sent you manna every day. He's going to send it tomorrow. It's going to be okay. I think,
Yeah.
I think working on gratitude is just the number one thing for a lot
Well,
of
and
different things. Yeah.
it's interesting too because we how often do we talk about like the Eucharist, meaning like Thanksgiving and all of this kind of stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that there is a uh, like being thankful and giving thanks are like different things, right? Like I don't always feel thankful
Yeah.
for stuff, but I can still proactively give thanks for the things that have been given,
Yes.
right? Like, oh, here's this thing, thank you. I don't feel thankful, but like I'm still gonna
I can still
pause
say
and
thank you.
give
Yeah.
thanks for
Yeah.
this thing.
Yeah.
And a giving of thanks or gratitude really is, I think, in some ways, I mean, it's just the opposite of discontent, right? Like
Yeah.
discontent says like this isn't good enough, but Thanksgiving says this is good enough, right? Like
Yeah.
the thing that's been given is enough for me.
Yeah. It's the
And
antidote. It's the opposite.
yeah,
Yeah.
and what's wild is every Sunday the church puts before us, right, like the body and blood of Christ as the Eucharistic meal, like what has he given us? Himself. Like he's given us his very self, and if that's not good enough, what is, like whatever could be good enough then? Like if the very body and
Right.
blood of our God is not enough for us, then what could be? And this isn't, of course, to say like trust in God and look on the bright side when everything's the worst. Like I am not a silver lining person at all. Like I cannot stand when things get silver lined. It's just, to
Yeah.
me, it feels like
There's
living in an unreality.
right. There's that
Um,
toxic positivity, right? Where it's just like you have to be positive all the time and it's not good. But it's
it's
not saying
gross.
that, right? It's like it's approaching reality and getting a full sense of what reality is because the truth is not everything is actually bad. There's this bad
Yes.
thing and then there's also this other thing that's pretty good and this other thing that's pretty good. And when
Yeah.
when it's all together and you're seeing the big picture, like that's when it's really healthy, right? Like not when you're turning your head away from the bad thing and ignoring it or pretending it's good, but when you're seeing it integrated into the real
Yes.
picture and not like you're not so myopically focused on it that it seems like it outshines everything else.
That's why I love the word and, right? Like, and like this thing is happening, and like God is good to me. This
That's
thing
right.
happened, and God also gave me a great cup of coffee this morning.
That's right.
Which he
Yeah.
did. He did give me a very, very good cup of coffee this morning. So
See?
I was very
God is good.
pleased.
Even when everything's lousy, God is good.
Yes.
And it's true. It really is, But, well, I guess this is all part of the journey of following Christ, right? Recognizing the parts of ourselves that we hold back for ourselves, the things that we think should be different, things that should be better, just other than they are, So I guess that's what we'll be thinking about is how do we use this 6-hour lunch break as a time to come back home and to sort of assess and to be grateful for a moment, to give thanks, maybe if you can't be grateful, and reorient ourselves, right? How do we do that? But,
well, that's the hope. So
that's what we'll work on. There you go.
Indeed. Elissa, how can people find you?
You can find me at my website, ElissaBjeletichDavis.com. I do have a profile on Facebook, not using it much anymore. I'm on Instagram, but I don't post things. I just look at things. But you could send me a message if you wanted to. How can people find you, Christian?
Well, I'm not on the socials as I've said before, but you can follow, OYM, the organization I work for, on Facebook and Instagram at the OYM official, or you can head over to our website at theoym.org and join our mailing list and just see what we've got coming down the pipeline.
Perfect. Good deal. Well, you know what else, actually? If any of you have like any experiences with this, if you're, I'm going to pause. Do we want to like say if you're thinking about this thing or maybe not? I was getting to the SpeakPipe link.
Yeah. I think we need to do that.
Yeah. So let's just say
these two are both kind of the same thing.
Yeah, that's really true. Did you already say the SpeakPipe link? And I just didn't notice. Oh, okay, good.
I was waiting for you because you're way better at it than
okay. Oh yeah. Well, and keep in mind. Okay. And we are always hoping to hear from you. So if you like, go on Ancient Faith Radio, go to our podcast page and click on the SpeakPipe link. You can actually leave us a message right there from your computer. And who knows, maybe we'll play it on the show. But we would love to hear what you guys have to say about the Noonday Demon.
Unless it's that you love him.
Yeah, don't say good things about him. He's bad.
Yeah. He's a really nice guy.
We're pro-Jesus here.
All right, Elissa.
This has been a listener-supported joint presentation of OYM, Orthodox Youth and Young Adult Ministries, and Ancient Faith Radio.